You know, my work on YouTube can often feel a lot like a Greek epic, but instead of cool fights with monsters, I'm pitted up against incredulous arsehole after incredulous arsehole. And not much has changed in broadening my scope to include the more general sort of absolute smegs in attempts to one day gain favour in the eyes of the gods of Cucklimpus. Nothing except I can no longer cry myself to sleep pretending that the ethical hollowness of the people I'm responding to is the result of ancient myths being upheld as sacred. This is humanity, this is humanity, and this is humanity, and that's fucking depressing. Now who's that on screen? Oh, I'll tell you. That, my friends, is RockingMrE, self-declared skeptic who loves to tell others to, quote, think for themselves, yet seemingly never offers peer-reviewed reference to base said thoughts upon. Thinking for yourself is only part of the equation. If you lack the information available, I can almost guarantee you that those thoughts will be absolute garbage. This is particularly important for the 4 videos on homosexuality we'll be discussing over this series, each video reviewing one of Mr. E's. I was originally sent Mr. E's video titled Causes of Same-Sex Attraction by a viewer, yet I saw Mr. E leaning heavily on 3 of his earlier videos in the description with, quote, having proven that homosexuality was never scientifically declassified as a mental illness and that it's strongly linked to psychological dysfunction, the question remains, what causes this if it isn't innate? End quote. So I thought, what the hell, let's give him all the time he needs to make his case. So I'll first be responding to Mr. E's video titled, When Degenerates Take Over Society, followed by How Homosexuality Was Declassified as a Mental Illness, followed by the link between homosexuality and mental illness, and finally ending with the before mentioned causes of same-sex attraction. So with that noted, let's get to it.
Ever more people are going to realise why homosexuality was once considered a mental illness. So why will an increasing number of people begin questioning this connection? Because increasingly we're going to see what happens when degenerates take over society. For example, legislation changes in the US state that's been more pivotal in pushing sexual degeneracy than arguably any other place, not only in the USA but the whole world, California. In September 2017, California made 2 changes to the law in the same month that relate to gay and transgender policy. The first change made knowingly infecting someone with HIV a misdemeanor instead of a felony, with a maximum penalty of just 6 months. The second change gave a maximum penalty of 1 year for healthcare workers using the wrong pronoun when referring to a senior patient. Just stop for a moment and think about that. Pause this video if you have to, but really digest it before proceeding. You can literally go to jail for longer in California if you use the same pronoun as someone's biological sex than if you knowingly infect someone with HIV.
Well, I did more than just think about it. I went ahead and checked what actually happened. Now sadly, when I went looking for references in your description, all I got were your social media links, so nothing of any actual value. Thankfully, I had the headlines you showed on screen which allow me to home in on the cases you were using, and I've got to ask, did you even bother to do the most basic fact-checking? Starting with the trans case, the law did not criminalise misgendering another person with up to a year in prison. This was a myth started in Christian papers and nationalist blogs like Breitbart, which then went through faux news where you picked it up. Meanwhile, the legal experts were tearing said narrative a new one. UC Davies law professor Courtney Jocelyn is paraphrased as having stated, quote, criminal charges would only follow, she said, if the violation reached a level that was shown to cause the risk of death or serious physical harm, in accordance with the state's existing penalty structure for health and safety code violations at long-time care centres, end quote. So we're not discussing general public, we're discussing care centres, and even then, it's just not true. Indeed, Senator Scott Wiener is also paraphrased as having stated that, quote, purposefully using the wrong pronoun would be treated the same way as someone who violates a centre smoking ban. It would be considered a minor violation, but no one is going to jail for that, end quote. So we have a bill which in no way creates new penalties, only extending pre-existing protections to groups including trans people, and the right-wing media has continued to lie about this even once corrected. Where have I seen this before? So there is no bill penalising misgendering, deliberate or otherwise, with a year imprisonment, and any claim otherwise is incredibly dishonest. You may as well be saying that mugging can carry a life sentence, adding the detail in your mind of the mugger also raping and murdering their victim. Sure, misgendering can be part of the issue, but it's not the issue itself that's going to get you incarcerated. Moving on to the HIV claim, and you know what? You don't fuck this one up too much. The only failure on your part I could find is the fact that you forgot to note why. The reason the penalty for knowingly putting someone at risk of HIV has been lessened from a maximum 6 years in prison down to 6 months in a county jail is simple. The penalty for knowingly putting someone at risk of any other communicable disease has always been a maximum of 6 months. HIV was singled out and penalised to a greater extent as part of the HIV panic, and only acts to suppress HIV testing and seeking support. It's kind of like having an exception to DUIs where if you were drunk on whiskey, your punishment is 12 times more severe than if you've been drinking any other kind of alcohol. Or as Wiener puts it, quote, "These felonies, which treat HIV differently than all other communicable diseases, stigmatise people living with HIV and discourage people from getting tested and into treatment," end quote. Now you're free to be angry if you think that the punishments are too low, but please present an argument based on evidence and not blind and raw assertion if you'd be so rational.
This is precisely the kind of madness you'd expect to see if mentally ill people are in charge. Mentally ill people are not only a danger to themselves, but to society as a whole. This is why, historically, mentally ill people have been locked away. Although certain past treatment of mentally ill people was unnecessarily cruel and inhumane, the truth is that some people are so mentally ill that unless they're kept out of mainstream society, they'll eventually bring about its demise. A problem when defining mental illness is that we have a simplistic idea of how a mentally ill person behaves. We assume that they might be so overtly hysterical or erratic that it's easy to spot. But in many instances, arguably the vast majority, mentally ill people can give the external impression of being relatively normal under most conditions.
Hey, we even do fully reference response videos to condescending jackasses who talk about the misconceptions others have surrounding people with mental disorders, whilst completely oblivious to their own grievous misconceptions. Most people with mental disorders are of no risk to society at all, though I'm interested to hear how you explain how an agoraphobic will doom all society. Like your paranoia surrounding people with mental disorders really doesn't look all too healthy, and you may want to have that examined by a specialist. Fact is, what I'm talking about isn't that unlikely. Now I know that you'll likely claim that your fear is rational, but the fact is researchers put that to the test. They compared people with direct contact and indirect contact to people with mental disorders along 3 tiers and found that the closer a person is to a person with a mental disorder, the less likely they are to perceive people with mental disorders as dangerous. Now they of course found that people with more contact were more likely to have been threatened or been harmed by people with mental disorders. If you do something more, then mathematically your chances of something going wrong increase. That's the truth of anything at all. Now the researchers found that said negative incidents did result in a slight increase in perceived danger, and yet more interestingly they found that the proximity to people with mental disorders, as mentioned previously, negated said effect. So people in society with no proximity to people with mental disorders view them with similar eyes as a minor few with close proximity that have had violent experiences. This is like everyone who's never ever seen a shark being as afraid to go into the sea as someone who's been attacked by a shark. That's not rational, and neither are your tinfoil ramblings about how society is being destroyed by people with mental disorders. Because all this does is beg the question, if the disabled beat the abled, are the disabled really the disabled? This is the same as the whole, we're the master race, here are all the flags of all the wars, we got utterly smashed in shit, we hear all the time. Oh, and just for clarity, I switched the next segment around a bit since Mr. E interjects mid-point. Why I don't know, since the point he makes could have been edited in at the start or at the end to create a better flowing video, but I'd rather just get this interjection out of the way and then tackle the actual point of the actual video.
Before proceeding, let me put the appeals to authority to rest from those that would accuse me of being unqualified to speak about mental illness, even though my description would be accepted by intellectually honest and competent professionals, despite my layman's explanation. As a proponent of philosophy and rationalism, not only do I reject the view that I cannot make observations about the world without being a scientist, doctor, or other academic with letters after my name, but I also oppose this view because it normalizes the idea that you can't trust your own mind. This is Pravda and Stasi-style thought policing that invariably leads to totalitarianism.
Says the guy who gargles Phonu's literary diarrhea without question before spitting it out on camera. You clearly don't know what an appeal to authority is. It's not us pointing out your lack of expertise. It'd be you going on the word of a perceived authority over the presented evidence, so like you do in your next video. Hell, you made an appeal to authority just now in claiming that quote,
even though my description would be accepted by intellectually honest and competent professionals, despite my layman's explanation.
Now that's not just an appeal to authority, but an appeal to an anonymous authority, which is by far the worst kind of an appeal to authority a person can make. Fact is, I understand said fallacy and its limits. For example, in how there is a consensus in science and that consensus can be called upon, but is never off limits for questioning since I acknowledge the rule of fallibility. I also don't care about your background, so long as you step up your game and start supplying valid, peer-reviewed references to back up your rampant assertions, as currently you're just running on pure opinion and my mind is so starved of intellectual content that I've taken to adding my own studies as seen in the last segment, even though there was really no need. I just thought my viewers may find it interesting as they like to learn. I know, it must be a weird concept to you being the all talk and no show flavour of philosophy.
However, there's one major giveaway of mental illness that the left has been determined to redefine. Above all, mental illness can be defined by a severe denial of reality. Some mentally ill people can indeed be raving lunatics that you can easily spot. But a denial of reality can also be extremely destructive, yet subtle enough to go unnoticed by all but the most observant or trained eye. Some will smugly suggest that even belief in God is therefore mentally ill, though this is wrong because other than certain practices like going to church, a religious person can live a perfectly normal life. It also doesn't matter whether you believe in God or not. What matters is whether you accept that reality has certain natural laws that can't be ignored, because if they are, this will lead to something harmful. Despite the denial, there's one thing we can say with absolute certainty about mental illness, tying into natural law. Someone with mental illness will inevitably exhibit destructive behaviour. In natural law, right actions lead to prosperity like health, happiness, vitality, longevity, and other qualities when working in harmony with natural law. Wrong actions lead to decline like sickness, misery, death, conflict, and all the harmful things you'd expect from destructive behaviour, even if you gain some short-term satisfaction.
This is wrong on so many levels. First, let's tackle the notion of natural law, since this is a religious argument based in an eclipsing ignorance of how science works and the way in which the natural world exists. You're playing a game of equivocation where you're relying on the facts that yes, natural laws do indeed exist to try and sneak in your crap. The trick you see comes in the facts that natural laws are descriptions of what we observe, not prescriptive rulings designed to dictate our lives as Mr. E is pretending. Nature and the science used to investigate it are amoral. They don't prescribe any sort of behaviour, meaning that any claims otherwise are ultimately the result of a person projecting themselves and their will onto nature. But moving on to Mr. E's definition of psychopathology, aka mental disorders, no. Just no. Denial can play a part in a mental disorder, but it is not a mental disorder in of itself. If that were the case, then incredulity would be a mental disorder, and yes, every theist on this planet would be included in that sum total, which is something I do not support. Though I do find it interesting that you start with this seemingly hardline definition of mental disorders, before then backing down and adding hints of the actual definition when you note a major issue with your original definition. Fact is, you didn't go far enough, so I'm going to go right ahead and supply the good viewers of YouTube the scientific perspective on what constitutes as a mental disorder, starting with the American Psychological Association's DSM-5, which states, and I do quote, "A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress in social, occupation, or other important activities. An expectable or cultural approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior, e.g. political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflicts result from a dysfunction in the individual, as described above." End quote. As for the World Health Organization's ICD-10 classification of mental and behavioral disorders, whilst its primary purpose is not defining but rather diagnosing mental disorders, it does offer us a short definition which states, quote, "Disorder is not an exact term, but is used here to imply the existence of a clinically recognizable set of symptoms or behavior associated in most cases with distress and with interference with personal functions. Social deviance or conflict alone, without personal dysfunction, should not be included in mental disorder as defined here." End quote. So that's both the American Psychological Association and the World Health Organization, two of the largest collectors of authorities on the topic, giving pretty much identical definitions. Now these definitions have their problems and are criticized regularly, but that's part of the process that got us to the definition now offered in the DSM-5 and the ICD-10, though I'll be interested to see how the ICD-11, currently coming out, defines mental disorders if that's one of the things that has been updated. However, in returning to your video, we find your claim that your definition would be accepted by intellectually honest and competent professionals to be completely devoid of basis. Nowhere in either definition was denial even mentioned, let alone as the sole or primary feature of a mental disorder. And I get the fact that you'll likely go all tinfoil on me with cries of the globalist World Health Organization. But I'd have to remind you to consider how that relates to the way you define mental disorders, because if you want to pretend that there's some international cabal without any evidence denying what we can observe, what does that make you by your definition?
On this basis, if homosexuality is indeed destructive and contrary to natural law, there should be evidence to prove this. In particular, is this connected to the kind of madness that leads to the aforementioned Californian laws? In the year 2003, a documentary was released called The Gift. As I pointed out in the past, the early part of the last decade was the last time anyone could be openly critical about sexual deviancy before this became impossible for all but the most outspoken. The Gift represents one of the last honest looks at sexual deviancy before cultural shifts in popular culture like Will and Grace and American Beauty made it completely politically incorrect not to represent LGBT people as perfectly normal, albeit struggling with societal prejudice and hate. But this is not the reality of sexual deviancy, and though not all mentally ill people are sexual deviants, all sexual deviants exhibit unstable and high-risk behaviour when an accurate diagnosis is made. The Gift is a shocking documentary that gives an inside view into the gay lifestyle and scene, which would make the most gullible supporter of the latest fashionable cause pause. It examines a sick and twisted trend in the San Francisco gay scene centred on bug chasers and gift givers. A bug chaser is a homosexual male that actively searches for another homosexual male that will infect him with HIV through anal penetration. Hence, this is also called bug chasing, the bug being HIV. Conversely, a gift giver is someone that gives the gift of HIV via anal penetration, usually to a bug chaser that actively seeks to receive HIV. In the early part of the last decade, when internet forums were a primary way to socialise online, many gay sites promoted so-called conversion parties in parts of the world, where gay men would meet up with the intent of spreading and contracting HIV through anal penetration, thus being converted to HIV positive. This is sometimes referred to as being charged up, posed, zapped, and other euphemisms for being infected with a terribly painful and destructive infection that only the most insane person would want to have.
A TV documentary of a few individuals is not evidence of a wider problem in a demographic that exists worldwide. There are many reasons science bases its perspective on research and not television. I can't believe I'm having to explain this to a self-declared rational person. But yeah, I can point to the fact that the BBC carried out an investigation and found that, quote, bug chasers supposedly look for conversion parties where HIV-positive men have the opportunity to pass on the virus to multiple partners. Dyer finds that an overwhelming majority of the talk is pure fantasy. Men who say they are bug chasers and gift givers fail to stand by their claims on camera, and one man who gave an anonymous interview subsequently appeared to be lying to the production team about his activities. His findings are echoed by HIV charities. Will Nutland, head of health promotion at Terence Higgins Trust, said, the concepts of gift giving and bug chaser are definitely based more in fantasy than reality. Most gay men with HIV do not want to pass HIV on, and most gay men who do not have HIV do not want to get infected. And Deborah Jack, chief executive on the National AIDS Trust, said, there is very little evidence of people trying to get infected with HIV. End quote. And yes, this is focused on the UK, but I couldn't find any statistics on prevalence anywhere. All I could find was a quantitative analysis like this one, which echoed what the BBC found in how, quote, these data suggest bug chasing and gift giving do exist, however a sizable portion of both bug chasers and gift givers were not intent on spreading HIV. End quote. Just for clarity, 70% of the study sample were people living in the US. Now I don't deny that this can occur, but the fact remains I can't find any quantitative analysis to support what you are saying. There seems to have been a very small number of cases that the media caught onto and then used this to construct a narrative you now are basing your worldview on. But honestly, it's a worldview built on sand. It crumbles under the slightest of scrutiny. If you disagree, then do the rational thing. Supply evidence to the contrary because your documentary is no better than anecdotal evidence. It's not scientific. By your own logic, I can watch a documentary about Richard Trenton Chase and then talk at length about how heterosexual men have this habit of cannibalizing others, sometimes digesting their organs in cola before drinking the remains. Now I won't because, unlike you, I know the phrase intellectual credibility. That's why I use evidence, and you just assert your opinion.
Apologists will reply that this isn't normal behaviour for homosexual men, but on average, homosexual males are not only far more promiscuous than straight people, but can have over 1,000 sexual partners, and sometimes much more. As you'd expect, this is snidely dismissed by apologists as impossible, when it's well known that sex parties are extremely popular in the gay scene.
Straight people have had swinger parties for millennia as well. Hell, there are even Christian swinger parties. So your point is what? Also, when you're talking about can have and sometimes, we're not talking about the average or the norm, but the extreme, which we can see the exact same in heterosexual people. But yes, LGBT plus people are more promiscuous on average. Now a part of that is due to social instability caused by prejudice. Society has for the longest time trampled on same-gender relationships, and whilst things have got better, it's not perfect. The social hostility, however, makes stable relationships more difficult. And remember, the results of social conflict are not a sign of mental disorder, instead said distress has to originate with the condition itself. That's something both the DSM and the ICD agree on. You can't abuse, say, black people to the point that they have an on average lower life expectancy and then use that to claim that being black is a mental disorder. The same is true of gay people and what you are doing here. You have to prove how a gay person can't function on the basis that they are gay and that basis alone, and you have to do so with studies, not documentaries, not pure conjecture, peer-reviewed journal articles. Now, another part of this is the fact that people within the homosexual demographic don't feel obliged to live their life one way if it isn't what they want to do. They're already stigmatized for being gay, so being stigmatized for being promiscuous kinda loses its bite. So it's not that heterosexual people don't want to do it, it's the fact that because they're not stigmatized for being heterosexual, they feel they can save face if they don't go public about it. Fact is, I don't see how having a lot of sexual partners equals bad outside of being the result of societal hostility. But that's not the multiple partners being bad, that's the societal hostility being bad. So long as everything's consensual and everyone has access to comprehensive sex education, it's perfectly fine.
So rather than having one-on-one sex with over 1,000 sexual partners, which would indeed be a struggle, this is achieved by having sexual encounters in orgy-like settings with many males. It's certainly not hard to see how such high numbers can be achieved under these circumstances, which also helps to explain why there's been such a rapid rise in cases of HIV, something that researchers have linked to behaviour like this. As you can imagine, others have tried to suggest that this problem is improving, but I see little evidence for this other than a decrease from levels that skyrocketed since HIV reduced in the 90s.
Well, allow me to help you out there. Your main problem is the fact that you were talking about the US whilst using statistics from Israel. Now, I could have a go at you for only reading the Science Daily article and not the journal article itself. But the fact is, it mentions the study is from Israel in the screenshot you had on screen. Right there. So it seems you couldn't even be bothered to read the little snippet you'd used for your video. It seems you just read the title and grabbed it. As for the article titled HIV on the Rise Among Young People, it's correct. However, HIV incidence still decreased by 7.9%, dropping from 41,800 cases of infection in 2010 down to 38,500 cases in 2015 for the entire US population. Now, this is due to the fact that there are a lot of variables involved with HIV rates. For heterosexual people, this decrease has been the most dramatic, whilst the incidence in all male homosexuals has plateaued and is no longer increasing nationwide across all age ranges. Yet we have seen a 19% increase in people aged 25 to 34, which becomes a 32% increase when we look at male homosexuals for the same age range. Lesbians, meanwhile, have such low transmission rates that they're not really discussed beyond the statement that, quote, in 2015, among females, the largest percentage of HIV infections was attributed to heterosexual contact, 87%, end quote. Which has some interesting and seemingly unintended consequences if you want to stick to your mythical notion of natural law. But don't worry if you find yourself unable to read the full report. They also publish an infographic to go along with it. So HIV infection rates are decreasing, and what's more is that the decrease is seen in the lowest age range as well. What I also found interesting, as made clear in the infographic, was that whilst the southern states along the Bible Belt make up a mere 38% of the US population, they account for 51% of all new infections. Now consider this fact compared to Mr. E's assertion that California was responsible for what is happening, not just in the US but worldwide. Yet the statistics show us the complete opposite. Areas with higher religiosity and hostility towards comprehensive sex education are the worst culprits when it comes to the spread of HIV. Why? Well, part of this is poor access to the before-mentioned comprehensive sex education, which not only teaches safe sex in heterosexual relationships, but all relationships. A meta-analysis of 80 independent studies from around the world found that comprehensive sex education significantly reduced risk behavior. Meanwhile, in southern states such as Texas, 58.3% of schools teach abstinence-only sex education, pseudo-education that's not only ineffective, but can actually be worse than receiving no sex education since it propagates numerous myths about sex. By the way, 25.1% of Texas schools take the no sex education approach. Only 16.6% teach abstinence plus sex education, and most of that is not comprehensive sex education and will only focus on heterosexual sex. And this is a trend seen throughout the southern states in general, with 7 states prohibiting discussing the existence of LGBT+ people, or even force them to frame said identities negatively. So this failure affects everyone in not being taught safe sex, yet in the few cases safe sex can be taught, most districts assume all students are heterosexual as justification to avoid the topic of safe sex for LGBT+ individuals, often due to personal discomfort or fear of bigoted parents. But this is not the only reason, as you're about to elaborate on, so we'll let you do that and then we'll return to the topic.
Also addressed in The Gift is the gay trend of anal penetration without a condom, called bareback, and this widely stigmatizes using protection. As well as this, it's taboo in gay circles to ask whether someone has HIV, leading to a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, even at the kind of parties where sexual interaction with many people in one night is the norm, as this would upset or offend HIV-positive men.
And I've seen the exact same sort of ideals shared by heterosexual people. Hell, many heterosexual men lie about being unable to wear a condom to try and skirt around the issue because they have this asinine belief that wearing condoms reduces the wearer's pleasure. So your attempts to portray this sort of risk behaviour as a gay-only phenomenon on the basis of a single documentary falls flat on its face. But risk behaviour is still more prevalent in the LGBT+ community, a fact I acknowledge openly. What's more is I'd like to go over why this is the case utilising not a documentary, but rather a study and a report carried out by San Francisco State University titled Supportive Families, Healthy Children, Helping Families with Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Children. Now the study compared the impact of growing up in a supportive versus rejective household on young LGBT+ adults aged 21 to 25. They found that LGBT+ individuals from households who rejected them on the basis of being LGBT+ were, quote, more than 8 times as likely to have attempted suicide, nearly 6 times as likely to report high levels of depression, more than 3 times as likely to have used illegal drugs, and more than 3 times as likely to be at high risk of HIV and sexually transmitted diseases. End quote. Now that last part relates to protection from STIs through, say, using a condom, as can be read in quote, and they were much more less likely to protect themselves from HIV or sexually transmitted diseases. This puts them at higher risk for getting HIV and AIDS. End quote. So if you actually believed all that crap you spewed about natural law and human well-being, you'd immediately cease and desist your hostility towards LGBT+ people and start campaigning for comprehensive sex education. I don't think you're going to do it, but that's because I don't think you care about your consistency.
Suddenly we see why it's San Francisco Senator Scott Wiener and the Californian gay lobby pushing hard to decriminalize knowingly infecting people with HIV. What do we expect when California is such a major breeding ground for this mentally insane degeneracy? This is RockingMrE, over and out.
Yeah, we know who you are and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Fact is, where's the link in what you are saying? Okay, let's just pretend that bug chasing and gift giving really was this massive phenomenon. How would that link the cases you mentioned earlier, one of which was an outright lie and another which ignored the actual context for the change? Currently, you're stuck with a non sequitur. That is, your conclusion does not follow the material presented in the video. Now I actually cut out a segment at the start of your video along with 2 clips from the documentary you used. I cut the footage from the documentary because I don't give a crap about said anecdotes, but I feel I should play the clip of you I removed from the beginning of your video here at the end, as it really helped me grasp the sort of mind behind such a poorly constructed video. But I didn't want my analysis of said segment at the start of your video to sour my viewers' perceptions of you prematurely, hence I moved it here to the end. If we could just play that clip, please.
Over several years online, putting truth before success has undoubtedly affected my audience growth. But however frustrating this is, there's nothing more frustrating than when the most popular online individuals get all the credit when they only start speaking out once the groundwork has already been laid. So I ask that you make a note of who talks about homosexuality honestly and rationally at the time of this video being uploaded, because as people increasingly grow more open to questioning the connection between mental illness and sexual deviancy, many will suddenly become a lot braver as the risks taken by smaller channels like mine are forgotten about.
This is genuinely disturbing for a number of reasons. What Mr. E is doing here is rewriting reality to construct a martyr narrative. Fun fact, ableism has never stopped being the go-to attack for anti-LGBT+ bigots. I alone have responded to hundreds of people making the exact same scientifically illiterate argument throughout my time here on YouTube. Mr. E is not breaking any new ground, and his channel's stunted growth certainly does not come from being a slave to the truth, as demonstrated repeatedly throughout this video. It seems that the E in his username stands for ego and nothing more. I also strongly believe that the word he was looking for whilst creating it was stroking, not rocking. Either way, that's one down, 3 more to go, as we will return to discuss Mr. E's views surrounding the declassification of homosexuality as a form of psychopathology. Till then, take care. Hi there, I'd just like to say a few things here at the end of the video before you go. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who's ever donated to the channel via Patreon, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, and Alexander Williams. Your support has ensured this channel its ability to grow over the years. I'd also like to ask that you comment down below and like this video, as well as subscribe, hit the bell icon, and follow Essence of Thought on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please also consider following Atheist Alliance International on Facebook, a humanist organisation dedicated to helping atheists around the globe. Any comments utilising language which insults others on the basis of perceived gender, sexuality, ethnicity or ability both mental and physical will be removed immediately, and the commenter may be blocked on the moderator's discretion. Let's work to keep this space one which upholds the values of humanism. Thank you.